If you're looking for a free resource on self-publishing that guides you through all the important steps from start to finish, then this video is for you. I've published more than 15 books at this point as a self-published author, and I've been doing this for 8 years now and absolutely loving it. And I've made so many videos on this channel trying to share with you everything that I learn along the way, but they're not really in any particular order. And a lot of times I get comments like, hey, can you do a video on this, when I've actually already done it? So I felt like, why not string all these videos together, the most valuable ones, in order so that you could follow through on how to self-publish from start to finish. There are 15 steps total and over 6 hours of footage that I was going through. So I decided to break them down into 3 specific videos. It's gonna look like this. Part 1 is what you're watching right now, and it will cover creating a book release budget so you can actually make money after publishing. Number 2, creating a book release timeline and choosing your release date. Number 3, how to title your book, plus series titles as well. Number 4, choosing your author name or your pen name. Number 5, writing a strong book description that will actually sell books. Number 6, finding, hiring, and working with editors. And number 7, the do's and don'ts for a cover design that your target readers will love. Part 2 is actually a compilation video that I already put together and published back in 2023, all about how to format your book. It covers a lot of things that most authors don't even know you need to know, such as an introduction to formatting, the 10 basic standard formatting rules, what to include for your front and back matter, choosing the size of your book and how to resize if you need to, choosing the font size and style, as well as how to use the style pane in Microsoft Word, adding images like your author photo or maybe other books that you've written in your backlist, adding fancy chapter headers, and then how to put all of that together in a quick summary to show you just how easy it really is. Part 2 will be linked below for you to watch whenever you're ready to start formatting, or you can even watch it sooner than that and get an idea of what's ahead. And then part 3 will be linked below when it goes live as well, and it will cover how and why you might want to set up a pre-order for your book, how to upload your book to multiple print-on-demand companies for both print books and ebooks, including companies like Kindle Direct Publishing, Ingram Spark, and Draft to Digital, a breakdown on something called ISBN numbers, what they are, if you need them, and where to get them, how to order a proof copy, aka a test copy of your book, before you press publish so you can see if it looks good, how to proofread your book effectively, how to submit your final book file so that there are no errors, and of course, we'll also talk about copyright really quick and chat about if you need it and how to do that if you'd like to copyright your book. Out of these 15 steps, there are 5 that I have never done a video on before, so you are gonna get a ton of brand new content from me. And because these videos are so long, I promise I will put chapters below so you can kind of skip around if you need to and always come back to things. If you're like, I just need to rewatch that again, you can rewatch as many times as you need. All right, let's start with creating a budget. My first tip is one that's honestly very, very simple, but not everybody does it. I don't know how else to say this except that it's one of those things that's overly simple and people just skip right past it. I don't know, but I'm a big saver. So my first biggest tip is don't spend what you don't have. I'm a really big believer in financial freedom and not having debt wherever possible. That's just a huge value of mine. I know not everybody feels that way, so you know, if you want to go a different route, that's totally fine. But I think personally that you're not really making money if the income is just going to pay off debts. You know what I mean? What I'm trying to say is that a business budget isn't just about figuring out where to spend, but it's also figuring out how to have a profit, how to actually be making more than what you're putting out. So the first thing that I think is really important is not spending what you don't have, which means that instead of putting things on a credit card, save up for them. If you want to publish a book, if you've decided that, you know, you create a book publishing budget and you want to spend, say, $1,000 or $2,000, or I don't know, maybe more than that. You guys have seen, I recently did a video on how much I spent on publishing a book. So it can get really expensive, but I did not ever, ever, ever go into debt for my books. Those expenses were always coming from the money that I had saved up and taken the time to make sure I had it in my pocket, ready to be spent, not something that I didn't have. Now, before I get any further into this video, I should say if you don't care about profit and you're doing self-publishing more for fun, then, you know, take this advice with a grain of salt. I'm coming at it from a very businessy perspective. I'm coming at it from I'm not just doing this as a hobby, this is my career, and I want it to be profitable, and I want it to be amazing, and I want to be able to continue doing it because there's money coming back in after I put it out. So again, if you're just doing this for fun, then spend whatever you want to spend. But this is very much my personal take as a business. And I don't want anybody to feel judged because honestly, at least in America, it's so easy to put things on credit cards, you guys. I get it. I really do get it because they're always encouraging you to spend more, you know, and it's like it doesn't cost you anything, but eventually it does. Eventually it comes back to bite you. And I just want you guys to be set up for success so that when you publish your book, you are immediately making money instead of giving that money over to the people that you borrowed it from. This kind of falls under the same umbrella, but it's kind of its own thing too. Authors tend to think they're going to be the unicorn, and we just assume my book is going to do well. It's going to make good money. I am going to get all of this money back. It'll be worth it. But to quote a movie, and comment below if you recognize this reference, you are not the exception, you are the rule. And so it's good and wise to approach budgeting with that mindset that you are not the exception, you are the rule. And the rule is that you're never guaranteed to make money. In fact, that should probably be the tip. It's never a guarantee that you're going to make that money back. So never hinge your plans on, I'm going to get all this money back. Whenever you spend money, just assume you might not see it again. And that can actually, weirdly enough, be a good thing, believe it or not, because it can help you to make smarter decisions if you view all of your financial spending with this lens. Because for example, if you were to go out and hire an editor and it was super expensive, like thousands of dollars, but you learned from it, it was almost like a course, like you did a class, like a college class, and you learned so much about writing and your craft just improved like 100 times, and you're so proud of your writing after working with that editor, then that could be a risk that's worth taking because you know that it's going to be beneficial to your career as a whole, even if you don't necessarily make your money back on that particular book. On the flip side, maybe you, what's a good example? Say you want to go out and hire a marketing team and you spend, I don't know, I'm gonna say like a really crazy amount, like $2,000 or $3,000. I don't really know what they charge because I've done my own marketing so far, but for example, you spend that much and then you find out that they didn't really do anything and you didn't really sell books. It was just like a flash in the pan and then it was done and that money never comes back to you. Was it really worth it? So it can help you to make decisions if you assume going into it, I may not make my money back. Is this still worth it? I'm gonna add another little bonus tip, which is not really a tip, but I just wanna encourage you that everybody makes mistakes. And so I don't know if this is really a tip so much as just an encouragement that sometimes you have to take the risk and you have to make the mistake to learn that it wasn't the right thing for you going forward in the future. Because just like I said at the beginning of this video, there's not really a set in stone, you know, rule book for being an author. Every author is so different. And so what works for one might not work for you. Sometimes the only way to find that out is through trial and error, unfortunately. Okay, coming back to the tips that I actually wrote down. My next one, I think this is number 3 now, is focus on needs versus wants. So I'm talking about actually making a list. Sit down, write it out like a pros and cons list. What do you need? Put that in a need column. And what is more of a want? You don't actually need it. For example, in my needs versus want column, I would definitely say that I need cover design. Even though I'm capable of making semi-usable cover, sort of. I have a whole video series on cover design, like a whole playlist. If you want to check it out, I will link it below. But you guys know I have strong feelings on cover design. And so even though I've played around with making them, when it comes to the books that I actually want to sell, that I intend to put a ton of marketing behind and I really believe in, I always make sure to hire a professional who knows what makes covers sell, because that's super important. So for me, in my needs column, a professional cover designer is at the very top of the list. And right below that, just as important to me, is a editor, because a professional editor is going to take my book's quality up to the next level. So I am a firm believer in those two things. Something that would go in the wants column for me is something like character art, because it is so much fun. I have gotten some of the most beautiful, beautiful character art for my stories, and I absolutely love them, you guys. I love seeing my characters done. It just means so much to me. But does it make me money? No. And so do I want to spend money on it? I mean, yeah, I might want to, but it's in the want column for a reason. I don't need to. I hope that makes sense. So everybody's list is going to be different. The things that fall under your need category versus the wants category are going to change from person to person. But it's important that you know, whenever you go to purchase something, which side of the list does that fall on? Is it a need or is it a want? And then my next tip is really a follow-up on that. They go seamlessly together, you guys, because my next tip is to budget your needs before you budget for your wants. So what I mean by that, it's so simple, but again, unless we sit down and intentionally go through and make a budgeting plan for ourselves and label all these things and figure it out in advance, we tend to do the exact opposite. So for example, if I didn't plan it out in advance, the first thing that I might buy as an excited author is honestly something like character art. But if I only have, say, a budget of $1,000, and say that I have a cover designer for $500 and an editor for another $500, that's my whole budget right there. I don't have any money to go towards a character artist as much as I might want it. I need to save up for that. That needs to be something that I hold out for in the future. Because remember, with our first tip, which is not spending what we don't have, I don't want to go out and spend money that I don't have. And so if I go out and I buy the wants before I buy the needs, that is going to shortcut me and make it so I either have to go into debt, which we talked about we really don't want to do because it sets you up for failure instead of setting you up for success. On the other hand, we would have to shortcut our dreams and maybe the quality of our book or the quality of the things that we actually need, such as getting a less qualified cover designer or not being able to hire the editor that you really wanted and having to go with somebody else instead. So this is kind of, again, a tip within the tip, which is to budget out beforehand. All of these things that I'm sharing with you are not things that you do as you go along and you just kind of wing it and you see what happens and, you know, hope for the best with each purchase. They are something that you want to do right from the start. You need to clarify what's important to you. Going back to the tips that I've shared, you need to figure out, what do you have available to spend? And then out of that, what are your needs versus your wants? And then how much are the needs going to cost? That's this tip right here. How much is it going to cost to get the things you need? And that leads to my last tip, is to track all your spending. It's really simple. I just use an Excel spreadsheet. Technically I use the one that's online in Google now. I'm gonna call it Google Spreadsheets. It's something like that. It's a very simple spreadsheet. All you really need to do, and this is applicable for taxes as well, is to track every single purchase that you make. And I like to put them in a category so that you know, is this going towards a need or is it going towards a want? And then I also track all income as well so that you can make sure that you're not spending more than you're making. This spreadsheet that I like to use is one that I give to my patrons in the resource club, and up, if you want to grab that, I will link it below. It's also on my website in my website store if you want. Again, it's really simple, but it's really, really helpful to track everything, and it's also something I use for my taxes every single year. And once you start to make money and you start to profit and have real income from your books, don't just go and spend everything you make. I think that's really obvious, but honestly, I have to admit that when I first started out, I was so excited that I just wanted to pour everything back into my books. And so kind of set a goal for yourself and how much you would like to actually have as profit that stays in your pocket every month so that you can figure out, how much do I actually want to spend out of that remaining amount if you have extra. This will help you figure out how much money you have actually available to spend after you take a certain amount for yourself and set it aside for savings and for just a little bit of a buffer. And whether that's 50% or 25% or 75%, only you can decide. But just like everything else in budgeting, it really helps to plan in advance instead of making impulse decisions. And I think we all know that, but it's worth saying it again. In today's video, we're gonna answer a question that I get all the time, which is, how do I set my deadlines as an indie author or self-published author? How do I know what they should be? How do I stick to them? I have a publishing timeline template or a publishing plan that I usually tell people about when they ask me this, because this whole thing, the template plus the, what is this, like 15+ page tutorial, is a freebie on my newsletter. All you have to do is go to my website, click the button that says sign up for newsletter, input your information, and you'll get it emailed to you along with some other goodies. I will link that below, but this has been my freebie for many years, and I'm super excited to walk you through it today because it's been a couple years since I've talked about it. I feel like not that many people know unless they actually go to my newsletter, sign up, and they're like, wait, you have this awesome freebie. We're going to talk about deadlines, and I'm going to use a real life example. You can apply these strategies to your own deadlines. I think it's going to be really helpful for you. So let me bring you, I'm going to kind of angle you like over my shoulder so that you can see me writing it out. Here's the template. I tried to make it all fit on one page. That was important to me because what I have done with this in the past, and it depends on my mood, honestly, and if I have space for it, but I will actually like put this up on the wall when I'm done with it, somewhere that I can look at it constantly and see my deadlines and have them front of mind, because that's also very helpful for keeping deadlines, is knowing what they are and making them a firm rule. Like, I am aiming for this, gonna make it happen. And I'm just gonna say this now because otherwise I'm gonna repeat it for every step. There are a good 15 to 20 pages in here that will be explaining each of these steps, breaking down why I do it, how I do it, and what kind of time frame I would typically suggest in case you're not sure and this is your first time and you kind of just need somebody to give you an estimate, and then you can kind of feel it out, decide if it was enough time for you, if you needed more, or maybe you needed less for different things. So this is very flexible, okay? For the most part, up until a certain point, you are setting deadlines for yourself, but if you need to, they can be moved. And then at a certain point, once you announce your release date, after you figured it out, that's when you're gonna wanna be really strict with yourself and try to stay on top of it. Okay. Trying to think how you'll be able to see this. All right, I hope you guys can see this. I'll try to give you a couple different angles in case this is tough, but the first thing you're gonna do is obviously put a title here. If you don't know yet, that's okay. You can just put your working title or your project title here. And I was trying to think what would be the best of my books right here to give you an example, but honestly, they've all been super different. I feel like The Stolen Kingdom took longer because I was actually working on all 4 books at once, so it took about a year and a half, versus other books have taken roughly a year exactly. And then The Secret Gift, which is smaller and something that I was much more comfortable with and knew what I was doing at that point, only took 4 months. So at this point, I actually think the most helpful thing to do is I've got a calendar pulled up, and I think I'm going to actually work on, again, I don't really have a name for this, so this is the work in progress title, Jezebel Book 2. Okay, so what I think I'm gonna do is give you an example with that, because that way I really can show you how it's a guesstimate. Like, I honest to goodness don't know, especially with a baby on the way. I have no idea what this is gonna look like. So I'm gonna walk through the one that's just for 1 book, but again, there's a 3-book option, and then you have how to use this template and all the steps explained in detail, so you can check that out after this video for sure. But the first step is outlining, and I'm a firm believer that you only need 1 to 2 weeks to outline. I don't think you actually need as much time as people tend to take, because the truth is, for most of us, we won't know until we start writing. My personal belief is start writing sooner rather than later. Don't let this be months and months of outlining, or you're never gonna get through the rest of the steps. And the goal, again, of setting deadlines is to actually have that forward momentum that moves you through each step. That's our goal. Let me actually use the calendar on my phone so that we don't have to keep jumping around. So today is the 20th. Let's say that I was starting literally tomorrow. I'm planning today and I'm starting with my plan tomorrow, which is the 21st of October. Okay. So in that case, I would go from October 21st to November 4th. But again, we're planning ahead, and I said 1 to 2 weeks. So we're gonna give ourselves a deadline that lets us start writing on the 1st of Nano. So I'm gonna say October 31st. October 21st through 31st, that's my deadline. And the nice thing about that, if you guys have been watching my vlogs, you know that I actually did already outline, but I've had way too much going on. I just told myself, you know what? This is wild. I do not have time for this. So I'm actually just going to start my first draft on November 1st. And if you've heard about NaNoWriMo, then you know that National Novel Writing Month is about writing a novel in just 30 days in the month of November, but really it's about writing 50,000 words, and I don't really know how big my book is going to be. I go into how to calculate that based on your word count, how many words you can write per day, and a ton of other questions to ask yourself here in this template. So that's something that you're going to want to go over. But in this case, for the sake of making it easy, let's say that I want to use the month of November. I don't actually know if I'll make it. If baby comes, I am not going to make this. So for me, personally, this is a very tentative date, and just keep that in mind. Like, you're setting deadlines, but life happens. If you have to move them, you have to move them, and you can always print out this template again. But typically, my favorite amount of time to draft, I should have put this in here, is 1 to 2 months. The happier side is 1 month, but often bigger books take longer. So 2 months it's still pretty stressful, but writing a first draft really fast is extremely beneficial. I have a lot of reasons for it. I'll link this video below on fast drafting if you want to know more. The next step is taking a break, and I talk about this in the template, how this can be as long or as short as you're able to do. So this can be anywhere from, I would say, 2 to 6 weeks or more, honestly. Sorry, my writing is terrible. But the idea here is to get rid of writer's blindness, where you've spent all this time drafting really close to the story, really focused on the nitty-gritty details. You just need to step away so that when you come back to edits, you have fresh eyes and you actually know what you're trying to do with the story. And so I find this break to be extremely valuable, and it's kind of handy because baby A is actually due on December 8th. So normally I would just make it a month, but the issue here is that I really don't know what life is going to look like after he arrives. So this is a really realistic estimate of a timeline, and it shows how with each novel it might change, because normally I would put December 31st and I would come right back into editing January 1st, 2022. Like, let's go. I am raring to go. But from what I'm gathering from the people in my life, I have so many wonderful people who know more about this than me. I'm gathering that 6 to 12 weeks minimum is what you want to take. And so that's a good 3 months. So I'm actually going to estimate all the way to the end of February. And I actually have to look to see, does February have, 28 days in 2022. So this is why it's helpful to have a calendar handy. So we're going to put February 28th. This next step is probably one of the most anxiety filled, because you usually see the most. You come back to it with fresh eyes, and at this point you're like, holy crap, there's so much that I need to do. And I go through this in more detail, but I broke up the self edits in this section into 2, when the reality is that you might do just 1 big pass of self edits, or you might do 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 passes, and you might jump around so that it's not even clear where one round of editing starts and another begins. But the reason I broke this up into a fast read through and then developmental, and honestly I think I will actually put other as well when I upload this new version to my newsletter, is because the fast read through is trying to get a reader's perspective of your story, getting the bird's eye view, so to speak. And this is going to help you because back when you were writing, you were very zoomed in. If you were looking at a tree, you were looking at the bark on the tree and, putting on one leaf at a time. But now you need to step back and see the forest. You need to know what exactly the whole big picture is. So the faster you can do this step, the better, while still making some good notes on what you want to change. For me, I'm a pretty fast reader, but again, you're making notes as you go. So I aim for about a week. And let's be real clear, this point in life and on is an absolute blank slate to me. I feel like it's a cliff and I don't really know what's going to happen when I jump off of it and the sweet little baby gets here. But let's pretend that I'm operating under my generally normal timelines just to put something on the calendar and see if I can do it. I would like to take a week to read, and weekends are hard because there's usually stuff going on. So I'm going to say March 1st to 8th. This would be how fast I normally would do a fast read through, because honestly, if it's taking you longer than that, you're going to start forgetting what you've read. If I can't do it this week, say this week is really busy because this is actually our anniversary week we'll be married 6 years at this point, then I might want to push that out. I might think, you know what? This is not doable with a new baby plus an anniversary that we're trying to celebrate, and maybe just getting back into it, that's too much. So let's say instead that I want to be be super realistic. So I'm going to start on the 6th through the 12th. And this next step of developmental edits is when you begin implementing all the notes that you took during the fast read through. Again, the template goes over that in detail. Don't worry. I have this urge to explain it to you, but I do want to encourage you to download it because I tried really hard to explain and give examples in the template. And this time frame honestly will include other edits as well. At least for me, your edits might be different and everybody approaches editing different. So this is just my personal preference and the stages that I like to go through, that if you're brand new, these will hopefully give you a starting point, but feel free to adapt the template and change things as needed. But when it comes to self edits, I usually take a month. So that would be March 13th, right? Through the next month, April 13th. I don't really need a calendar for that. I just plan to finish here. And my goal will be to have done the bigger picture edits, as well as most likely some of the smaller edits during this time frame. Even though this is my standard, I'm gonna have a brand new baby. So is this doable? I don't know. If I was being really careful, really cautious, and I wanted to do a timeline that would give me a sense of the longer end of things, I might change this to the 30th. But because I'm me, because I like to be optimistic, I usually think I can do more than I can do, I'm gonna leave it on the 13th because at this point, nothing is set in stone. You don't have to set things in stone until you announce your cover reveal and your release date. And we'll get to that. All right, so requesting beta readers is where things start to overlap. And this is something that I like to give the beta readers at least 1 to 2 weeks notice, sometimes even more, like 3 or 4 weeks, so that they can tell me if they actually have time and if they actually are able to read. And so if you are requesting beta readers for the first time, you would also probably want to build in a couple weeks to be asking and putting up a sign up or asking in other places, depending on how you do it, on social media, etc. I might, for example, if I were brand new, I might ask my beta readers all the way back at the beginning of March. But because I have a really awesome beta reader team, I feel pretty good about asking them at the beginning of April after I've started some of my developmental edits and I know if I'm going to make this deadline. And sometimes for me, this editing step blends with the editing for beta reader step and it's sort of a smooth transition. You almost don't see the difference because they're so similar. But in this case, I'm going to take the rest of that month. I'm going to say April 13th through to the 30th, and that way I am spending the whole month editing. And then my goal, as you can see, I'm just going with the next date. So after the 30th, wait, does April have 30 days? Yes, it does. Okay. Now that I'm looking at a calendar though, this is honestly what you should do is you should look at, is that actually a good day to send, or would it be better to send to betas on the weekend? So maybe the 29th. This is going to be messy, but it's going to give you guys a good visual. I'm going to change this to the 28th, and then I'm going to change this. This is going to be a little messier. Let's see if I can make it look semi-pretty for you. No, I think this is going to be a fail, but April 29th, because again, as you saw here, that's a Friday, and I like the idea of sending to betas on a Friday because they can start reading over the weekend and hopefully get off to a really nice start. And I talk about beta readers a lot on this channel, so I will link this playlist right here where I have 6 videos on beta readers at this point, including my updated process. But typically it's anywhere from 2 weeks for a really short book like this one, this was super fast, to maybe 5 or 6 weeks for a longer book, especially if you haven't worked with these beta readers before and you're new to the beta reader process. Since I'm not new to it, I feel pretty confident about doing a shorter time frame, but I don't know how long this next book is going to be. So my average for beta readers has always been about a month. Let's look at the calendar, and May 29th is a Sunday, so that's actually a pretty good day to ask them to finish by May 29th. This step right here, when you start editing for beta reader feedback, I'm going to take a full month starting on May 30th to June 30th. We're already halfway through, and I think you're probably getting the idea. After you just scribble in guesstimates and you get to the end, and you might have found that you do a lot of this like I do, you can print out a fresh one, write it in really clean, or even do a PDF on your computer for something pretty to put on your wall, and again, be able to look at your deadlines. But let's go to the next one, which is editing for your editor. And this again blends with the editing based on beta feedback quite a bit, but I kind of separate these because sometimes I just need a little bit of extra time. I like to get through the beta feedback, have a deadline for that, and then take one more self-editing pass at the novel, thinking of the editor instead and double checking that I got everything. Let's take a look at our calendar and start with July 1st. And honestly, I only really need a week for this, hopefully at this point, because I'm just kind of skipping around, catching any last minute things that I think of. And so at this point, I would be able to send to my editor on July 8th. Now, this is really important to pause here because, of course, it is depending on another person. And you'll notice that whenever something is dependent on another person, I put it in bold on the template. The reason this could be an issue is if I wait until the last minute to hire an editor on this date, it's going to be very unlikely that they're going to have room for me. So I actually typically will book my editor further back, but now that I know this is the date that I want to send it to them, I'm going to start asking them and booking my editor back here, probably in April or even further back, maybe in February or even in January. I could book an editor that far back if I felt confident that I could make this date. Now again, I've published a lot of books, not just fiction books, but also nonfiction books right here. And so I've done this enough to normally be very, very confident. And I would probably book my editor back after finishing the first draft. I would feel confident enough all the way back then. But because I have a baby on the way, I am much more in the shoes of a brand new debut author, just trying to figure out what it's going to look like and not really knowing for sure. So in this case, I might wait till somewhere more around April when I'm working with beta readers before I book an editor. And at that point, some editors are booked. So I might find that they say, I'm so sorry, I am booked for July and I'm booked for August, but I can take you in September. And at that point, I would scribble out this date and readjust. But let's pretend that I have this date for now. We're just doing tentative dates for the things that depend on other people. And for the most part, I have found that editors typically take 1 month to read and edit. And that means as long as things go well, my editor will finish around August 8th. At this point, I'm going to look at a calendar because that is a Monday, and I can sometimes do all my edits in 1 week when I'm completing the editor's notes, which is our next step right here. But again, with a new baby, I don't know if that'll be doable. So let's say I'd like to take this week and then I'm going to give myself an extra buffer week, and I'm going to try to complete them by August 19th. At that point, August 20th is a Saturday, but we're going to go with it. And that is when I would begin proofreading, except I'm going to pause here and I'm going to explain this more in the template, but I like to read from a proof copy. So I actually wait to do this step until I have a proof copy. So we're actually going to jump down to here and we're going to order a proof copy. But to do that, that's actually dependent on this formatting step. And formatting is something I personally do DIY. I have this whole entire series right here that I will link below if you want to know how I do my DIY formatting. But I write in a formatted template and then I usually take about, I would say, I guess 2 to 3 days to finalize the formatting. So actually that's what I would do first on August 20th. That was a Saturday. I don't usually work Sundays, so I'm going to give myself till the 23rd. Then I'm going to order a proof copy on August 24th. And again, in the template, I talk about how different print-on-demand companies take different amount of times to get you that proof copy. But I typically order from KDP. So KDP is super fast. I usually expect them to get the book to me by a week later, if not sooner. I've had them do it as early as 4 days, but we're going to guesstimate August 31st. So then here again, I have to scribble because I was getting ahead of myself, but proofreading does not begin until the book arrives for me because I want to proofread the physical book, which, if you're curious, arrives like this with a not for resale. And then I actually do my proofreading notes right in the document like this. And again, I have a video on that right here that you can check out, and I'll link that below if you want to know more about how I proofread. But looking at our calendar, we can start on September 1st. And then just like the fast read through, I like this step to be as quick as possible so I can again get that bird's eye view, that reader's perspective. So my goal with a new baby, we'll see how it goes, would be to read in a week, finishing by September 7th. So we've just filled in those 3. They kind of work in tandem, as you can tell. And once you finish your proofreading and you implement those proofreading notes, this is when the book is going to be done. You're actually going to have a complete manuscript that's fully ready to go. But as you can see, we still have a lot of sections to fill out. This section on is more about the publishing and marketing, whereas this section and up was about writing the book and preparing the manuscript itself. So now a lot of these things that we're going to talk about are happening during the writing and editing process. But I keep them separate in their own section like this instead of bumping them up because I do need to know this full timeline first before I can accurately make good judgment calls for when these other deadlines are going to happen. This is when our calendar is going to come into play quite a bit more, because I want to have my cover design done long before that September 7th deadline. But I don't want to hire them too soon before I know what the book is about. I don't even know what the title is yet. There's a lot of details I haven't figured out. So usually the best place to hire a cover designer is somewhere within this section. After the first draft, maybe during your break, you could do some research, and then especially as you're doing your edits and you're beginning to be confident that this is the right story and you have a title and you know what it's about at this point, maybe you have to work with beta readers before you really feel confident about all of that. Maybe you need their help figuring out which title is the best title and getting their opinions on that. But the good news is that you don't have to have all this information when you hire the cover designer. You just need it for when you begin working with them. So I like to hire them during the earlier editing stages, somewhere in the second, third, or maybe fourth draft. And then I hire them for a date further out to begin working with them, typically around the time where I send it to my editor, because then I have that whole month away from the book to work on marketing things like this and spend time thinking about what do I want the title to be and making that decision and sending all the information to the cover designer. So in a perfect world, I might choose to work with a cover designer sometime right in the middle of this. Maybe like mid-July, I could start working with them on, say, the 18th. And I'm again going to update this template so that it includes work with, because I think they are two deadlines. So the hiring deadline, where you're going to spend time figuring out who you want to work with and then asking them what their schedule looks like, you might do that all the way back in March. I'm just going to list the whole month of March, but then I want to work with them sometime in July. And the reason that I'm not putting more specific dates is, again, because this is in bold. This depends on another person. It depends on what their schedule looks like. They might tell you, I'm so sorry, I don't have anything in July, but I can get started with you on August 1st. And then you would say, okay, awesome. Let's plan on that. Now, we talked about working with your editor back here because, again, that was part of the writing and editing process, but you do have to actually hire them. And along with that, you have to research and find them. But like I said, this is something you're going to have to do long before you actually work with your editor, because editors can be booked up for months, just like cover designers, which means that I would also probably want to be looking for an editor right around this time as well. And honestly, editors can book out, at least my favorite editor, Natalia Lee, shout out to her, can book even further back. I think she's booked out like half a year. So I could actually use my break to find and book an editor if I felt confident about this date. So let's pretend I did use my break and I book in January or February. Those two things are happening much earlier on, but we needed to know the writing process before we could plan out when to start that. These are deadlines we're going to want to keep in our back pocket, but then there are others that come in later in the game, like the synopsis or the back blurb, which is that description that a reader is going to see on Amazon when they decide whether or not to buy your book. I have two stages. I like to write the rough draft for my beta so that they know what the story is about when I'm asking them if they want to read it. So that would mean I'd need to have it by April 1st. But then I like to have my final draft, and again, sorry this is messy, by the time I start working with my cover designer, because they're going to need to know that information, not only to design a good cover that reflects the story, but also because if you're having a full paperback wrap, then they're going to need to be able to put the blurb on the back like this. And since I said I was working with a cover designer in July, I would want to have a finished back blurb by June 30th or even sooner. Once you have your cover design completed and your back blurb, you are ready to upload to the print-on-demand company. If all has gone well with my cover designer, we probably would spend a whole month working on the cover. Just keep in mind that it could take longer, so I might give myself a little buffer time. But let's say that the cover and the back blurb and everything I need to upload to the print-on-demand company is ready by August 10th. So that would be my goal, to have a little bit of buffer time. But the reason that I need to know this information is because this sets up the pre-order as well, and you have to submit that pre-order a few days in advance before the pre-order link will be live. And I personally think it's really, really valuable to share the pre-order when I share the cover reveal. So I'm announcing the release date, but also the pre-order, and I'm going to update this on the form as well. Don't worry. I think it's extremely important to have that pre-order linked up. And because KDP says that they take anywhere from 1 to 3 days, I'm going to guess that it would be uploaded by the 13th, and I would be able to gather the links, maybe send a newsletter on the 15th, and then do my big cover reveal announcement on August 16th. That's really exciting. This is getting real. So now we have sending ARC copies. I intentionally didn't put any other big marketing goals and deadlines besides these two, the cover reveal and the ARC copies, because other marketing goals and deadlines are honestly going to depend on each individual author, and they change, and that's okay. But the cover reveal and the ARC copies are two of the biggest marketing tools you can have in your back pocket, and I talk more about this in here as well and explain more about that. But if you want to know, I also have this video right here about how I send ARC copies, and I think it's really valuable to do that at least a month before release. And to do this, you obviously need to have your manuscript finished and ready to go, as well as the cover and of course the blurb, because how are you going to convince your ARC readers to read if they don't know what it's about? Knowing all that, I would usually do ARCs after a cover reveal and also after the proofreading and formatting have been done. And so we already saw up here, September 7th is when I guesstimate that the book will be done. But I'm going to go ahead and update this template to also request ARC readers first, because this is actually also a two-step. So when I request, I want it to be about 2 weeks before I'm actually ready to send it out. So if I know I want to send them by September 7th, that's when it'll be done. Maybe I'll send on the weekend again. So let's say September 9th. Then I want to start asking for ARC readers 2 weeks before that, which would be August 26th. But really, just keep in mind that you're talking about it that whole 2 weeks. You're mentioning it on social media, putting up reminders, but then you're actually going to send the ARCs 2 weeks later. And we decided on September 9th because that's a Friday, and I just feel like that's a good time for people to start reading. Now, a lot of other marketing goals and deadlines are going to happen starting with the cover reveal and on. And in case I didn't mention this enough at the beginning, we do have 5 books on this topic. So I will link all of these books below along with the series page, because they are actually free to read on Kindle Unlimited. But these steps can take as long or as short as you want them to. I think they're probably going to start for me with that August 16th cover reveal right here, and then they're going to last for 1, 2, maybe 3 or even more months depending on when my release date is. So I'm going to leave that blank for a second, because our last section here is buffer time, and I talk about this a lot in the template, but things go wrong. I have talked about this so many times before. You never know exactly what might happen. You might have your editor needing more time, or your cover designer needs more time, or maybe uploading to the print on demand company there are errors and you have to go back and figure that out. Whatever the case may be, you want to give yourself some buffer time, and I personally like at least 1 to 2 months of extra time that may get eaten up by some of these steps that was unexpected. So especially for me with a brand new baby and I don't know what life is going to look like, I would verge on this 2-month time frame. All right, let's pull up our calendar. We're going to take that September 7th day when the book itself was done right there, and I'm going to go a full 2 months. So 1 month, October 5th, 2 months, November 2nd, and that time frame is my buffer time. And I don't personally love releasing books during NaNoWriMo, so I might jump back just 1 week to October 25th right here, which is a Tuesday. And again, I talk about this in the template, why Tuesdays are valuable, but I also give you some other options to consider so that you can know if you want to do a Tuesday release or maybe a different day. But again, we had our buffer time was September 8th, right? Based on the day after this through technically November 2nd, or again, because I don't want to release in November, I'm going to jump back just 1 week to October 25th. There we go. So our marketing goals and deadlines are also going to be through October 25th, and technically further out than that as well, but we'll just say the 25th for now, because you want to keep talking about your book after release as well. Look at that. We officially have a release date, and that is how you go through the template. I hope this was helpful for you. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. And again, it's in my newsletter, my author newsletter, which is linked below. You can go grab this for free if you'd like to. I need to title the second and third book in this series, and so I figured what better time to do a video on book titles than when I have to do a book title myself. This way I can show you in real time what I actually do and let you know all of my like tips that I can come up with, best practices, things that I make sure I do as I'm trying to find the best title for my book. And it might seem like, you know, naming your child or something where it's important, but it's a personal decision. But I would argue that it's actually extremely important for book sales, because besides your cover art and your back blurb that tells the reader what the story is about, the title is one of the most important things that will make a reader decide whether or not a book is for them, aka whether or not they will buy it. So in this video, I'm going to share with you my 5 steps to brainstorming your book title, and then I'm going to follow that up with some really important tips to make sure it's a solid title that will actually help you sell books, and some tips on how to also do a series title, which is going to be similar, but there's going to be some bonus tips for that as well. All right, let's talk about how to brainstorm a good book title. The first step is to brainstorm all the possible words by themselves that could potentially be included in your book title. It might seem really basic, but this step is actually huge. So brainstorm as many words as you possibly can. If they go together, awesome, but they don't have to at this point. The goal is to get a list of all the words that could potentially work for your book title that sound intriguing, that make you think of the story. So the first place you would start, and I'm going to talk more about this later, is words that are commonly used in your genre. So in the fantasy genre, I'm going to show you my bookshelf just to show you how common these words are. Sarah J. Maas is a good example of a ton of royalty words: court, throne, crown, heir, empire, kingdom. Here's some more royalty right here: prince, king, queen, king. Another common one is to have a curse of some kind, as you can see here. Or I see a lot of shadow and storm and bones, and also stars are really commonly mentioned on fantasy book titles as well as sci-fi book titles. Here we have some more royalty, as well as right here there's a lot of wars in fantasy books. So there you go, just to name a few. As I'm saying this, if you happen to read fantasy, or even if you don't, you might recognize a bunch of these things in some of your favorite book titles, right? So that's the first place that I would start. After you've exhausted all the genre-specific words that you can think of, I usually will move on to things specifically from the book itself, so that it's especially unique to the book. So that could be a character's name, or a quote from the book, or just like a tiny quote, obviously like a very short piece. For example, everything is actually a quote pulled from inside the book itself. Or here's another great example: the selection actually refers to something that happens in the book where there is a selection. And then here's a great example of naming after a character, because these are actually characters in the book. Cinder, Scarlet, Cress, and Winter are all characters in the Lunar Chronicles series. Caraval is another good example because it refers to a specific, I think it's a place technically in the story. And it's okay if, as you're brainstorming different possibilities, if you come up with more than one word, like a phrase instead, because another thing you could do is just think of a phrase that reminds you of the book itself. Like, for example, 100 Days of Sunlight. I can't remember if that's referred to in the book, but it does describe what happens in the book and what the book is about. And so that's another thing you can consider as you're coming up with titles, is maybe using a phrase that is maybe referencing something people will recognize as old as time, A Whole New World, whether it's a movie or a classic book, maybe with a twist like To Kill a Kingdom, or even maybe a song or something like that people might recognize. This is just the start of my list because he is already waking up, but just a little tip here as well. After you get a good list of words that you do like, you can also go and search for synonyms for those words. Like maybe there's something else that's better than locked, that means like something that the character doesn't know yet about themselves, that could help me. So I can go through this list and write a bunch more possibilities with synonyms of these words right here. My second step is to start puzzling these different words together in all different types of formats and sentence structures. And a tip for this one is to actually use your bookshelf to give you ideas as well, because there's some really unique sentence structures out there. For example, down here we have Aurora's End, Aurora burning, and Aurora rising. So clearly the author started with the main character Aurora, and then they added a verb that described what happened: rising, burning, end. Obviously you don't have to puzzle words together if you'd prefer to attempt one-word titles like this from the Legend series right here. And there's tons of great titles that are just one word that usually hint at what the story is about really nicely. But if you feel like you're not finding one word that hints at the story, that's when you can go to puzzle out more words put together. So a really common one that you'll see all the time is the adjective noun. And my series actually does this as well with the Stolen Kingdom. It's the adjective noun. And I do that throughout all 4 books, as you can see here. After you try some one-word titles, you might move on to maybe some 2-word titles and then 3-word titles. There's a lot you can do. You'll see a lot of noun and noun, or another common one is noun of noun, or maybe just the noun, like this series here, or the noun of noun. And after the 3-word titles, we get into some longer titles again using Sarah J. Maas. We've got a blank of blank and blank, which is actually pretty commonly used in fantasy. As you can see, here's another example, a blank of blank and blank. Or sometimes there'll be phrases like deal with the elf king, dance with the Fey Prince, the sun is also a star, the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, once upon a broken heart. And these longer phrases are doing a really interesting trick that I want to talk about in the bonus section next. So I'm going to put a pin in that for right now. So coming back to the tip where we are still puzzling it out and trying different sentence structures of our words put together to see if anything just really pops and is very interesting. As you're doing this, my biggest tip here is to make sure that it's something that will be memorable. And to do that, it's usually going to be something that's shorter rather than longer. For example, Twilight is 1 word, and it's going to be a lot easier for readers to remember than the ACOTAR series, which I still can't remember without looking, is a court of, oh sorry, I was referencing book 3 all this time, A Court of Thorns and Roses. It's a pretty title, but it's really hard to remember. And even though Sarah J. Maas can get away with it, most of us other authors can't, because a reader is going to be like, oh, there's this great book, I just can't remember what it's called. That recommendation, that word of mouth that could have made a sale, is going to fall flat if the reader can't even remember what your book is called. All right, once you've put together a bunch of different sentence structures that you like, the 3rd step is to narrow the list down to somewhere between 5 to 10, maybe even 15 of your favorite options. And as you're narrowing them down, don't forget to prioritize the ones that are memorable and that fit in your genre. The 4th step then is to actually go onto a bookseller like Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or even Goodreads if you want to, and then start searching your book titles. Your goal here is to find something that's not already taken, at the very least that's not taken in your specific genre, because you don't want competition when you're trying to sell your book. You don't want somebody else's book to come up in search instead of your own. I should note here that this is most important for book 1 in a series or for standalones. It's not as important when it comes to a book 2 or a book 3, but I still like to search and figure out, is this something that's like super common? Like for example, say you didn't know about the Hunger Games and you tried to title your book The Hunger Games, and then when you search it, you're like, oh, that's definitely taken and it's a big deal. Then you do not want to be titling your book something that's going to potentially make a reader click on it, get mad that it's not the book they thought it was, and leave you an angry review. So I would recommend, again, even if it is a book 2 or 3 or so on in a series, avoid using another book title if at all possible. Keep in mind that for me, I've already picked a title convention, so to speak, a pattern where the title is the adjective noun. And so that's been the case for all of the books. The Stolen Kingdom, the Jenny Key, the Cursed Hunter, the Enchanted Crown, which means that for me, it's a little bit easier because I already know the pattern that I want to go with. I just don't know what the adjective and noun will be, but I know it'll be the adjective noun in some way, shape, or form. The 5th and final step, once you have a title that you love, is to then run that title by author friends or reader friends and see what they think and get a second opinion. This is going to help you know if you have a good book title, or if maybe you need to rinse and repeat, go all the way back to step 1, or maybe just a couple steps back and go through the steps again to get new options. So I would really recommend not settling, and if you do need to go back and go through the steps again to find something that's the perfect fit for your book, I think it's really worth it. What do you think? Is that a good idea? You think I should keep thinking about it? But as you're going through these steps, how do you determine if it's actually a good, solid title that's going to sell books for you? Let's talk about that next, because I have some tips for things that will help your title be intriguing and grab a reader's attention and make them want to read your book. We kind of touched on the first one already, which is memorability, but I can't emphasize this enough, just how important this is, because if you have a book title, maybe it's named after a character with a weird name and your reader doesn't recognize it, they are not going to remember and be able to find it in the search bar later on. Word of mouth is actually one of the best marketing tools we have at our disposal as indie authors. So think of memorability like this. It is easier to remember a book title if it is shorter, and it's also easier to remember if it has recognizable words. Better yet, if it has something really intriguing and attention grabbing in the title, like the way the Hunger Games are mixed together. But we'll get into that in an upcoming tip. The second bonus tip is searchability. And so again, I kind of touched on this one when I said a book that is not taken, because you don't want a reader to type into search and a different book shows up instead. So searchability is huge. You can't technically copyright a book title. So yes, you could title a book The Hunger Games, I think. I'm pretty sure, if you wanted to. But like I mentioned, that would be a mistake, because you're just going to get a lot of angry reviews from readers who were expecting a different book that was more known by that name. So not only is it better to not compete, but it helps with searchability if your book is the only one with that title. And searchability would again include recognizable words and not having any strange spelling. The third bonus tip is to have a hook. And this means just anything in the title that's going to intrigue the reader and grab their attention. And there's two ways that I can think of off the top of my head to do this. One would be making the reader ask a question. So with The Stolen Kingdom, the question that a reader would ask is, who stole the kingdom and why are they stealing it? And it leads the reader to hopefully want to know more. Another way you could do this is if the title tells a story, like A Deal with the Elf King, because obviously we know the story is about making a deal with the Elf King. So that's telling you a story that also is intriguing and grabs your attention. My fourth bonus tip is genre relevant keywords. I mentioned this briefly, but the reason they are so helpful is because they will tell a reader that this book is for them subconsciously. A reader doesn't even realize they're thinking this way, but if you have something that sounds like a horror novel that's in fantasy, it's going to be a lot less attractive than something that, like we talked about, is, you know, the throne with the kingdom and the stars, something like that. My fifth bonus tip, and this is relating back to memorability, is to find a pattern of some sort. This could be alliteration, which is a pattern in the consonants. So for example, the princess, P, and the prince has a nice pattern to it. Or you can use rhyming to create a pattern in the vowels. So for example, wishes and kisses. My sixth bonus tip is to ask yourself, how is this going to look on the cover? Is it like a word with 20 characters in it and it's going to have to be shrunk down super tiny so it barely even fits and it's not very readable? Or is it maybe a shorter word that's going to pop on the cover? And then my seventh bonus tip is kind of specific to a series, but it could still work on a standalone book as well, and that is to have repetition. So what I mean by that is make it look like they belong together by repeating certain elements. It could be a repetition of sentence structure, like a curse so dark and lonely, a heart so fierce and broken, a vow so bold and deadly. Or one that you don't see maybe quite as much but is still pretty common is a repetition of the same word in a series. So the winner's curse, the winner's kiss, and the winner's crime all begin with the winners. And speaking of series, I'm going to share some extra tips for coming up with a series title. First things first, coming up with a series name does start out very similar to coming up with a regular book title. So you're going to brainstorm words, puzzle them together into different sentence formats, narrow down your list, and then search those series titles on a bookseller like Amazon or maybe on Goodreads to see if they're already taken or if they'll be a good fit. And of course, then also run them by other author and reader friends to see what they think and get a second opinion. But on top of that, there are actually a few extra, I would say, standards when it comes to naming a series that I wanted to share in this video, so you have a few extra tricks in your back pocket, or however that saying goes. The most common is, of course, naming the whole series after book one, which is what we see with the Atazadeh series. It's what I did with the Stolen Kingdom series, the Graceling series, the Caraval series. You get the point. It's probably the most commonly done way of naming a series. series. But the second standard is pretty commonly done as well, and that is to have the first book's title plus a synonym for the word series, like saga or duology or trilogy or chronicles, or I'm drawing a blank, but something along those lines, like the Twilight Saga, for example. And then the third style is to have something that still references the fact that this is a series, so it has usually one of those synonyms like series or saga or chronicles or trilogy or something, but it has a brand new name for the actual series itself, like for example the Lunar Chronicles. I think all of these options do include in some way, shape, or form a hint to the reader that this is a series, and I think that's really helpful. Okay, now let's recap, because I know it can be a little bit annoying to have to take notes and try to remember everything and wonder, did I miss something? So here are the questions that you should ask yourself as you're coming up with your final book title. Number 1, is it memorable? Number 2, is it searchable, aka not taken? Number 3, does it sound like it belongs in my genre, aka am I using some keywords that are in my genre? Number 4, is it short and sweet? Number 5, does it have a hook? AKA, does it make the reader want to know more, maybe by telling a story or asking a question? Number 6, does it give you a sense of what the story is about? Number 7, are you settling on your first option, or have you spent a lot of time on this and made sure that you picked the best possible title for your book? Number 8, have you run this title by others to get a second opinion? Number 9, did you ask yourself, how is this going to look on the cover? And number 10, if you have multiple books, will it have a solid pattern that will be recognizable to readers and let them know these books belong together in a series? Before we keep going to the next video, I just wanted to pop in really quick and talk about author names / pen names, which is something I've never really talked about before because I don't have a pen name, but I know a lot of indie authors struggle with this, trying to decide, do I make up a name or do I use my real name? How do I know? How do I figure out what name to use and where? So let's talk about it. The first thing you should note is that the business side of things is different from when you're actually putting in your author name on an individual book. So if you are setting up accounts, typically you will use either a business name if you have an LLC or something like that. You might use your real name, or you could use a DBA, which stands for doing business as. And there's a lot of ways to do that business side. I am not an expert, but I will say that for me, I have set up a business called Grace House Press, and that's what I use when I'm setting up all the tax information and the account business side of things. Then on the book side of things, when you're actually uploading specific individual books, that is where you would put an author name or a pen name, depending on what you prefer. It's honestly that simple. The hard part, I think, is for authors to figure out, well, do I actually want a pen name or need one? And then secondly, if I do, what should it be? Like, how do I decide? So when it comes to deciding if you need a pen name, I think there's a few questions you can ask yourself, such as, do I want people in my real life potentially searching my name and accidentally stumbling across my book? If that bothers you, that would be one indicator that you want a pen name instead of using your real name. Another example would be if you really like your privacy and you just want to kind of control who can find you and if they can find you by your real name or not. On the flip side, some people might really be excited to use their real name and very proud, and there's nothing wrong with that either. So it's really up to you. It's a very personal decision. So nobody, including me, can tell you what to do, but you can definitely take your time thinking about it, because once you make a decision, your author name, pen name, or real will be out there. If you decide to move forward with your real name, you're good to go. You're just gonna put that in the author section when you're creating your book. But if you wanna use a pen name, the next step is obviously to decide what that will be. And really the sky is the limit. It could be anything, but you obviously wanna think of your target readers and kind of their expectations, what's common in the genre, what you feel comfortable typing out, and obviously spelling is always a good thing to consider as well, because you want it to be easy for your readers to remember. So it could be very simple for you. You might want to use mostly your real name, maybe just change your first name to initials or use your middle name instead of a last name, or you might want to pull a name completely out of thin air, and so you got to do some brainstorming just like you would for a character. This is kind of a big decision, so again, it's totally normal if you want to take your time and really think about it, run it by some author friends or friends and family, but I just want to caution you that once the author name is out there, you can always add other pen names or your real name, but you can't really take a pen name back. So just take your time thinking about it before you commit. Next, let's talk about the book description. Your book's blurb, aka this description on the back of the book, is extremely important to successfully selling books. In fact, I would go so far as to say that besides the cover, it's the second most important thing you can ever do that can make or break sales. So, no pressure. This is going to be a really chill video because it is 8:50 and I finally got my little guy to go to sleep. It's been a rough day, okay? I don't know what's going on. He had a rough day. So I had a rough day, which means that we're just gonna do this really casual and talk about writing book blurbs. And I'm gonna be really honest with you, I have put off doing this video for years, honestly, because I'm not an expert. I'm just somebody who's had a lot of practice. And so I realized that, you know what, I have actually picked up a lot of tips along the way. I have learned a lot of really valuable things that I can share with you, such as what a typical word count might be and what tense to write the blurb in, and the three, like, I guess you could call them like crucial elements to a blurb that grabs the reader's attention and makes them want to read, and I guess kind of some things that do the opposite as well. I think honestly, as writers, we struggle to write blurbs because this is a very small amount of words when we're used to writing a lot more than that. So it's just not the same skill set, you know what I mean? But that doesn't give us an excuse to get lazy because, again, this really does make or break sales. I'm not actually being extremist here. This is something where if a reader started reading the first bit of the book and they're like, yeah, I'm not that interested, they'll very likely click away, versus if you grab their attention, make them need to know what happens, it could be a one-click buy. That's how valuable and important the blurb is. And again, I'm calling it a blurb because that's just kind of the common word for it, but you can call it a book description, back of the book. It's kind of an interchangeable word, but we're gonna go with blurb because I just say that by habit. I've got notes here because I really wanna make sure that I don't miss anything. So we're gonna talk about 3 things that a great blurb should do, which is hooking the reader with a really attention-grabbing first line, teasing them with the initial story problem, sharing just enough to make them interested without giving everything away, and number 3, ending with a cliffhanger that makes them want to know more, or better yet, need to know more. I'll give you a few examples of that, and then I actually have 5 other tips that I wrote down as well that I want to make sure to touch on. So let's just get right into it. Here is the hook. It's usually the first line or short paragraph. It's the most important part of the blurb. No pressure again. But on a lot of online vendors, this is literally all a reader even sees unless they're tempted by it enough to click the read more button. Trust me, I have made mistakes. I've learned the hard way that this is not the space to talk about the world or list out a bunch of character names, unless you're somebody famous. If you've seen that before, they can get away with it if they're more famous, just FYI. But that is not what's going to hook a reader. A good hook makes them want to know more by bringing up something they need to know the answer to. Let me give you a few examples of hooks that I love. The Cruel Prince is one of my favorites, and the first line is, "Of course I want to be like them. They're beautiful as blades forged in some divine fire. They will live forever." That gives me chills. I just love that. Another favorite book of mine, if you haven't read this, I highly recommend it. It's called The Thief by Megan Wayland Turner. Eugenides, I never know how to say his name. The Queen's thief can steal anything, or so he says. Right there, it's setting up the type of character he is as well in a very, very distinct way, and I love it in just one line. Last but not least, The Stolen Kingdom, which is my book, and I worked very hard on this first line, so I thought I'd include it to give you an example from somebody who's not famous, but hopefully did a good job, hopefully. How can she protect her kingdom if she can't protect herself? Okay, let's apply this to one of my upcoming books, The Queen's Rise. This one is actually a bind up of 3 books that I've already published, so it's kind of weird, but I technically have 3 different blurbs for this one book, and so I have a bunch of different things that I've already brainstormed that I can pull from, but I wanted to point out that it makes more sense to lean on the beginning of a book, and again, that initial problem, than to try to reference things that happen later on that don't make sense until you get to know the character and all that. So typically, one of the tips, this is like a bonus tip, is to lean on more beginning information and beginning knowledge. I guess, same thing. We'll see what happens. But right now, my first line, okay, this is my attempt at a hook so far. And again, I tweak these all the way up until release day and after. But right now I have this. How did the dark fairy in every fairy tale become the villain? Maybe she started out as an innocent Jinny girl with a dangerous shape-shifting ability that breaks every rule in Jin. All right, the next really important element of a successful blurb after the hook is something I'm gonna call the initial story problem, or conflict if you're being more writerly than me. So that initial conflict, okay, you can call it the, inciting incident. That took me way too long to remember. So basically, the reason I say inciting incident or the initial conflict, story problem, whatever you want to call this, the first big thing that your character has to face, a lot of us writers try to cram all the problems that they have to face into the story. And again, hinting at things that come later on in the book tends to get very confusing very quickly. Not to mention, there's not nearly enough space. We're going to talk about how long a typical blurb is in a little bit, but the goal for this section is 2 to 4 paragraphs, and honestly, the shorter, the better. Now that said, just keep in mind when you're first drafting it, don't worry about the word count right away. The more you can just get it out on the page and get a bunch of ideas out, the better. But when it comes to the final blurb, you're going to have to edit that down quite a bit because typically blurbs are on the shorter side. The shorter, the better. In fact, this is the best place to put it, so I'm just going to go with it. A typical blurb is less than 250 words. That's really short. If you are struggling with this, trust me, you are not the only one. This is extremely difficult for most writers because we have the habit of writing 50K or more novels. Like, we write a lot of words, right? Typically way more than 50K for our novels. So then to suddenly only write 250 and to try to cram all the story into that, which again, is not actually the goal we should have, but sometimes it feels like our goal. That is just two very separate things. And honestly, like I said earlier, they're two different skill sets. But the positive spin to that, if you want to put it that way, is just like writing a novel is a skill set that you learned and got better at, you can get better at writing blurbs too. And I speak from experience. I have written some terrible blurbs in the past, and I'll talk more about that when we get to the other tips. But before I go on to the last one, let me give you an example from The Queen's Rise, because again, this is technically 3 separate books, right? So I could be very, very tempted to try to squeeze some feature or facet from each of the 3 books into this one blurb. And I was actually tempted to do that, but I just kept it focused on that initial story problem in book 1. So let me give you an example of that here. Jezebel is forced to keep her gift secret or risk having her ability severed, stolen from her completely. That's that initial problem. Despite the danger, part of her is desperate to embrace her power. That's her initial reaction to the problem, right? And then the reaction continues in the next paragraph. When Jezebel's friends discover a portal to the human world, she follows them in, unable to resist the temptation to explore her gift where no one will see. Except someone does. Someone Jezebel thought she could trust. And then I put in big parentheses here, all caps, the problem just grew worse. So it's the same problem, right? We're just expanding on it and making it clearly get worse. His betrayal comes in whispers at first, but all too quickly those whispers become demands, and he'll stop at nothing, not even blackmail, to use Jezebel's power for himself. And then I put in parentheses, the problem is even more severe. Obviously, like dun 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 is kind of the vibe you want to go for here. And this is obviously not the whole story because that would be a really short book. You know what I mean? But you can see how I took that initial problem and I just ramped it up and made the reader want to know more. Hopefully. Let me know what you think, because again, writing is subjective. I'm just doing my best. So let me know if I accomplished that. And I honestly think it's probably a percentage. Like we're all working for 100% of readers being like, I have to know what happens. But I think it really depends on the person as well. So like some people might be intrigued and some people won't, but we're just going for as many people as possible. The cliffhanger is next. And I almost want to say this is more important than the hook. It's really, really a tie, honestly, because this is like that one last line or last paragraph. It's usually pretty short. It's almost like the barb on the hook where they like try to pull away and then they're like, oh, I can't. I have to know. I have to know what happens. That is what we're going for here. That feeling, that emotion in your reader. This raises a question that the readers want to know the answer to. It doesn't have to be an actual question, but you'll notice if you read a lot of blurbs that it often is. Okay, I'm using The Queen's Rise as an example again, and don't worry, I'll put this all together so you can see it all in one, but here is an example of the cliffhanger I currently have for The Queen's Rise. One dark decision leads to another until Jezebel stands to lose something she can't live without, either her freedom or her innocence? And the question this hopefully brings up is, which one is she going to choose? And how is she going to choose if she literally can't live without either one? Like, how the heck is she going to choose, right? And again, that might intrigue some people more than others. So you have to keep that in mind too. And sometimes that means getting outside opinions. So I'm actually jumping into one of my tips right off the get-go, which is to get feedback, get outside opinions, because this cliffhanger is not the one that I started with. It's not even my second or third or fourth. This is one that I got while brainstorming with one of my critique partners, and she pointed out, I think I originally had something that just wasn't that cliffhangery. She's like, well, why would the reader care about that? What should the reader actually be caring about? And it led to this cliffhanger, which is way stronger. And that kind of goes hand in hand with my second bonus tip, which I already kind of mentioned, and that's to revise and revise and revise again. Like, if you're going to do it for your novel, do that for your blurb too, because it's so short. It's really not that hard. In fact, because it is so short, I've actually gotten into the habit of attempting to write like 3 or 4 totally separate versions and then trying to meld together my favorite parts of those versions, because that way I have a lot more to pull from and a lot more ideas. And sometimes that 4th or even 5th attempt at the blurb is where I really find the attention grabbing things that I didn't think to mention right off the bat, if that makes sense. My third tip is to write in the present tense. And this is surprisingly hard to do if you typically write in past tense, which I do, although I really like present tense and I kind of want to switch to that in the future. But typically, almost always actually, this used to be a pretty hard and fast rule and it's been broken 1 or 2 times, but almost always it's present tense, third person. I have seen the third person side of this broken a little bit more often in recent years, specifically in YA, because YA often is written in first person, not third person. That said, the typical rule, so to speak, is that even if your book is in first person, typically the blurb itself should be in third person, because it's saying, you know, Jezebel and the Ginny Prince, not I am blah, 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 blah. I think because it's just disorienting. Essentially, third person is just easier for a reader who's brand new to the book, never heard of it before, to be like, okay, I understand what's going on here. So typically third person is what you're gonna see. And then present tense is simply to make it more active, which makes it more interesting. So again, your book does not have to actually be present tense. None of my books so far have been present tense, although again, I'd like to try it, but all of my blurbs are present tense, and you will see, or you should see, every single book on your shelf is also present tense. That's pretty much an industry standard, just something to be aware of. And you might find yourself writing a blurb in past tense and you don't even realize it. So again, going back to my tips, it can help to get feedback, have other people read through it and maybe catch some of those verbs, but also you can read through yourself and watch for any verbs that accidentally slip back into past tense. It's pretty much all in the verbs. And that leads to my next tip, which is really, really, really strong verbs. Make that your focus, because there are so few words in a blurb. Those verbs, this is rhyming in a really weird way. The verbs are really, really, really important, and the stronger you can make them, the better. So one of the rounds of revision that I typically do for a blurb is I literally take a look at every single verb or even every single sentence, and I see if I can strengthen the verb in that sentence, maybe move things around, maybe get rid of some adverbs, but I typically try to add in stronger verbs with each round of revisions, and that has helped me a lot as well. I keep putting the book down and then picking it back up, because the next tip, I kind of already said this, but I wanted to include it one more time in the tip section just in case you missed it earlier, is that your typical blurb is going to be less than 250 words. The Queen's Rise blurb, which is the one we've been using in this video as an example, is 146 words if you count just the story blurb itself. But I also have extra blurb content, which is going to be my next tip. And so just let me add in that really quick and see what it comes out to total with that. 191, including all my extra blurb content on top of the story blurb itself. Okay, let's talk about this extra blurb content, because that is my last exciting tip, is to consider adding in a few extra things that are like, they're still technically the blurb or the stuff that goes on the back of the book, so it could be considered the book description, but it's not the story description, it's other elements, for a lack of a better word. So let me break down a few examples for you. A lot of times famous authors will put things like their credentials, so like New York Times bestselling author brings to you, or this such and such book was, like, I should actually go look it up. I've seen a couple today. Cinder, this is a great example. This book is breaking the hook rules because they're actually using credentials as the hook. Hey, if you're famous and you have something like the New York Times as a credential, that's a fantastic hook for a reader to see, honestly. So it says the first book in the #1 New York Times and USA Today best-selling Lunar Chronicle series by Marissa Meyer. The second thing you could consider, which is also in this Cinder review, I know there's an actual word for it, but when an author or a credible source is kind of like blurbing something for you. So for example, right here they cited Entertainment Weekly, an interesting mashup of fairy tales and science fiction, a cross between Cinderella, Terminator, and Star Wars. And then they had another credible source that they cited that is the Wall Street Journal, Prince Charming Among the Cyborgs. I love it. So author credits and those like citations slash blurbs from credible sources. Gosh, I don't know what to call that. Number 3 is something that was kind of in there by accident, but it's something you could do intentionally yourself as the author without needing someone else to do it for you, is to mention your inspiration or your comp books, as they're often called. So comp book just means comparison book. You'll see almost all famous books do this. So I always found it odd when people would question it, like, are you allowed to say you're like this other book? Because yeah, it's literally called a comp book. It's used in marketing by literally every publishing house ever. But let me give you an example from the Queen's Rise series. So I actually did this in 2 different ways. So the first one is this. The Queen's Rise series is inspired by your favorite fairy tale villains in Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, and Beauty and the Beast. So that's the inspiration. Then I also included the comps like this. If you love fairy tale retellings like the Lunar Chronicles and supernatural abilities like the Graceling series, then you'll love the Queen's Rise series. And obviously you want to be accurate for this, so don't just throw out comps like, ooh, this book is famous, so I'm just going to include them. That will hurt you in your reviews. Readers will be like, they said it was this and it wasn't. You do not want that. But if you can find comp books that are very similar to yours, especially if it's a fun, like kind of blending of 2 books, they can be on the more well-known side or they can be a little less known. I don't think there's any hard and fast rule, but I would say that the upsides to the more well-known books are more readers are going to be like, oh, I like that, and so I want it. But the downside would be that if it doesn't exactly match up to a really famous book, that might lead to some disappointment if they're like, I really wanted a copycat, and that's really not what we want to do, so I doubt your book will be a copycat, and that might let readers down. So sometimes it can be nice to find kind of a happy medium, but ultimately, like, whatever inspired your book and whatever is similar to your book is what it is. I will note that not everybody likes to do comps, so it depends on the author. You do not have to do this at all. This is just something to consider. Some authors don't like comps because they're worried that it might turn readers off. If there are readers who are like, I don't like the Lunar Chronicles or I don't like Graceling, they might decide, well, I don't want to read Bethany's book either. But for me, I feel like the pros outweigh the cons. Like there's more likely that people will give it a chance than that it will turn people away. So I love to use comp books. I have a couple more left. You can also include early reviews if the book's not out yet, or 5-star reviews if the book has come out and you've had some really amazing ones, or even better, if possible, you could include reviews from fellow authors, especially authors in your genre if they happen to have read it. And that's almost more under the blurbing or the credible source, where if you happen to have some authors, like I have some great author friends who, if they leave a review, I will put their review and then I'll put their name, comma, author of XYZ book. And that I think includes more credibility as well. You don't have to do this. Again, this is just something to consider. You could pull from your ARC reader team, and if they're leaving reviews for you on Goodreads, then you could copy that review, put it in your description. Then you could take just like a 1-line excerpt from their review. I wouldn't go too long. Usually reviews are long, so you might just want to take a piece of it. Then you can just put like 5-star review and in parentheses, Goodreads reviewer or something like that. Or your ARC team transfers their Goodreads reviews over to Amazon like they're supposed to, which is amazing. And I'm always so thankful when my team does that. Then you can just change the Goodreads review, like parentheses, to say Amazon reviewer instead. And you can even quote their name if you want to. Then you literally have credibility where if people were to scroll down, they would find that review that you're referencing and be like, oh, cool, it's right there. Another one that I do nowadays, because people used to be like, I thought I could read at any point in the series, is I started including a reading order for the series. And so it's like, okay, book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, like read in this order. And I feel like it's self-explanatory. And if authors write standalones, they almost always will say this book can be read on its own, right? Which include that as well. If you're writing a standalone, then you could say this book can be read on its own or something like that. But I did. I started including the reading order because I was just like, I guess it's not clear, so why not? I have the room, I have the space, and that leads to my last tip, which is feel free to be creative. I would say balance this with being professional, right? So you don't want people to ever read a blurb and be like, ooh, this is awkward. This reads like a journal entry. You want it to stay professional, stay like a product description, right? So keep it to describing the product, but you can get creative and include some of those things that give you credit, that make the readers want to know more about the book, that grab their attention, hook them. All of those kinds of things can actually be really valuable and only enhance your blurb. But again, coming back to all our other tips, just continue to revise, continue to get feedback, continue to make sure it's not too long, keep it on the shorter side if possible, and I think you can do great things. If you want to see this in action, I'm going to put on the screen here the final blurb for the Queen's Rise series. You can pause this video and read it if you're interested, and hopefully see these things in action. Again, I'm not perfect at it, but I hope you can see that there's a hook, there's an initial story problem, there's a cliffhanger, all under 250 words, present tense, third person, with some of that awesome extra blurb content like the inspiration and the comp books. And normally there would be a reading order here, but since this is just the omnibus, I'm probably going to craft something. Oh, I didn't do it for this video because I just thought of it now, but I need to create some kind of one-liner that says, let's see if I can think how to say this. Something along the lines of, The Queen's Rise is a bind-up of 3 full novels in the Queen's Rise series, and then I'd list out the books: The Secret Gift, The Secret Shadow, and The Secret Curse by Bethany Atazadeh. And the whole purpose of that, because it might be like, why? Why include that? Why is that necessary? But it is to prevent readers from getting upset if they buy every book from me ever, but they already bought those 3 books, they already read the story. That helps them know, hey, these books have been previously published, this is like a different format. And I also might craft a note. Ooh, how am I going to do this? I will want to make it very clear that the omnibus has exclusive bonus content as well. And obviously the gorgeous character art cover, but hopefully that will be clear. That'll just give you a sense of other things that you might want to consider including, anything that's going to help your reader understand what they're getting into and make them want to read your book. That's really your underlying goal. Let's talk about how to find, hire, and work with a professional editor, as well as exactly when you need to do this step as a self-published author. Before I even get into it though, I think it's really important, just in case anybody watching doesn't know, that in the publishing industry, there's typically considered to be 3 different kinds of editors, sometimes 4 depending on who you ask. So the first one is developmental editors. They will typically help you with the foundation of the story, the characters, just the really big overarching plot type stuff, and they don't usually get very nitty-gritty and do grammatical stuff or line-by-line edits, although you never know, it depends on the editor. The second kind, and the one that's sometimes split up into 2 different kinds, is the line editor or copy editor. Sometimes they're called both, sometimes they'll split it up. It really depends on the person, which is why this is kind of a big gray area in publishing. But line editors are exactly what they sound like. They go line by line. Typically this is much more detailed, comprehensive. They're helping you with your style a lot, which I love, and they're helping you to catch inconsistency, things that are unclear, that kind of stuff. So this is like what you most often think of when you think of a book editor, and my personal favorite. And sometimes, like I said, they're blended together, and so a line editor will also do copy edits, but copy edits can also be their own separate thing depending on which editor you talk to, and it can mean the more grammatical side of things where they're really looking at the copy. Depending on the editor, it can almost be more of like a proofread and really close to that. And that's the third type of editor you might consider hiring, which is a professional proofreader. So the reason that you need to know the difference between all of these 3 is that some authors will hire all 3 and they want everything. And then other authors might just hire 1 or 2 of them and try to get some free eyes on the story, such as beta readers or critique partners, to take care of the other things. And then other authors, typically ones that are more seasoned and have been doing this a while and had time to build up a network of other author friends, might even not hire anybody if they have friends in their space who have editing skill sets and they can do swaps with those people, such as critique partners or beta readers, for example. Personally, I think that 99 99.9% of authors really need a professional editor when starting out. Even if you literally went to school to become an editor, which is what I did, I still can tell you from personal experience, I desperately needed to learn from a professional what it looked like to edit a book specifically. There's a lot of things that are book specific that you just won't know. So I have hired and worked with multiple editors at this point on the 15 plus books that I've written here. Some of them have been great experiences, some of them not so much. And I have a lot of advice to share that I've just been nervous to share because some of this is very opinion based. And I just want you to know that if you don't agree, that's fine. But I'm just gonna share my experience and try to give you a well-rounded picture of what this looks like. I also want to touch on pricing before we get into finding, hiring, and working with an editor, because that deserves a bit of attention too, considering how expensive editors can be. Developmental especially, but also copy and line edits very often are over $1,000, sometimes quite a bit more depending on who you decide to work with. And proofreading can also be a few $100s as well. A lot goes into this pricing. Sometimes editors just price themselves extremely high and just gotta be aware of that. Other editors might still be building their portfolio, so they'll give you a bit more of a deal. It really depends on the person, but it also depends on your book's word count, aka how long your book is, and what shape it's in, because editors will typically wanna see a sample, which we'll talk about, and get an idea of how much are we actually gonna have to do here, and then they might give you a price based on that. So what do you do if you're on a budget like most of us are? One option you could choose to do is look at hiring a professional editor as a sort of college class or master class in how to edit a novel, because you learn so much from a good editor. It can honestly be worth paying somebody if they're really good and they're teaching you quite a bit. It can be worth the cost. Or you could consider just hiring some of these and then using beta readers or critique partners for other types of edits, which is what I did. For example, I'll just give you a little insight onto what I personally did. Instead of hiring a developmental editor, I actually took the time to go out and find beta readers, which if you don't know are literally just any readers who are willing to read a rough draft of the story and give you good feedback. And I was able to work with beta readers and kind of develop a relationship with these people that they could tell me a lot of the same things that a developmental editor would. Like, this character makes no sense. Please work on this part of the story. It's very slow, but obviously a little bit nicer than that, hopefully. And I do have a video series about beta readers if you want to know more about that. So that's what I did after the second or third draft of my book. And then towards the very end, when you need a proofreader to kind of just do that final proof check, I actually have a lot of skill sets in that myself, being that I did go to school for that. And I have some people in my life who are also very detail oriented and know what to look for. So I once again was able to ask for help and then do that myself. The edit that I couldn't do was the one kind of in the middle. It usually comes after you've done as much editing as you possibly can think of yourself and you've worked with beta readers. It's the line/copy edit, and that one was the one where I felt like I really wanted to hire an editor, and I was very thankful every single time that I did, because I learned so much from them. And I did this for many years until I ended up working with an amazing critique partner who also had editing skills like I do and was able to do swaps with me so that we started to help each other out for free. All right, we got that out of the way. Let's talk about how to find an editor. Early on, I actually used Goodreads because they have a forum specifically for editors to share their, portfolios and let authors know that they're free to work with. I believe this is still a thing where editors will kind of put themselves out there, or authors can also put themselves out there and be like, hey, I'm looking for an editor. Is anybody interested? So that's one option. I've also known friends who use platforms like Fiverr, for example, and there are editors on places like that. The problem with these platforms, though, is that it's really hard to verify if they're actually a good and professional editor. That said, if you do go this route, I would definitely encourage you to verify as much as you possibly can. So you could look at their portfolio and say, okay, these are the authors they say they worked with. Let's actually look those books up on, Amazon or whatever. Look in the back if you can, or in the front if possible, and see if that editor is actually listed in the book. Try to read the first chapter excerpt if you can and look for any errors to see if there's it's really clean editing or if it has some issues. And if you feel comfortable, you could even reach out to that author and ask them, how was your experience working with this editor? I really want to know. I have also used platforms like Reedsy.com. If you've ever heard of this, this is a much more professional website that does require background checks, and it does actually have contracts. So it has a lot of benefits, but those benefits make it more expensive. I have found that the editors on this website are like the most expensive I have ever seen. Some of them honestly more than I think is right. So just be aware of that and get, some comparison quotes from multiple people and maybe off of Reedsy as well, just to get a sense of what's standard at the time of you hiring somebody, because some of them price themselves twice as much as they should. Honestly. That said, though, I will be very upfront with you that this website led to one of the highest quality edits I ever received, probably because of the expense and also the fact that there is a required contract that kind of holds them to doing the best work that they can. In other words, you get what you pay for, honestly, and just keep that in mind when you're doing your research. Obviously, you could probably Google just like book editor as well. But if you want a more specific targeted way, the third way that I personally went about trying to find a quality book editor was actually by asking author friends. And a very similar way that you could do this, if you haven't built up a network of author friends yet, is to go and look at some of your favorite books on the shelf, open it up to typically the acknowledgements page is where an author will thank their editor, and you could find their name, kind of reverse engineer, Google them, see if they have a website, see what their prices and availability are, and see if they might be interested in working with you. But how do you choose and actually hire an editor once you've found a good kind of pool of potential editors that you might want to work with? I would highly encourage you to compare a few things, specifically their prices, their communication styles, and if you vibe with them, their timelines, aka their availability, like if they're a year out or if they're available next month, etc. And most importantly, their editing style, which you can learn about by asking for something called a sample edit. This is one of my favorite things, although it can be very nerve-wracking in the moment, but I also think it's one of the most important things you can ask an editor is for a sample edit. And this might look like the first chapter, the first 10 pages, or maybe 10 pages from the middle of the book. It really depends on the editor, but I think it's kind of a red flag if they're not willing to do a small sample edit, because this is pretty standard in the editing industry. And then after a set amount of time that they will communicate with you, they will edit your book, those pages, and return that to you as a sample edit to give you an idea of what their editing actually looks like. I cannot tell you who to pick because everybody's gonna vibe with different people, have different preferences, but I will tell you what I personally look for. And the first thing is, I guess you could boil it down to timeline/communication. How quickly were they able to complete the edit? Did they do it in the timeline that they said they would? Or did things come up? Because whatever they do with the sample edit is probably how they're going to be with the actual edit as well. So if things get frustrating there, that's kind of a red flag for me. Or were they completely on schedule or even ahead of schedule? That's awesome. I love to see that. The second thing that I like to look for is, how do I describe this? It's kind of like a Goldilocks thing. How much editing did they do? Was it too little, too much, or just right? Because I've had some editors who just literally fixed a couple commas, and if you're paying a hand and a foot, or what's it called? An arm and a leg, sorry. If you're paying an arm and a leg for edits, that's not enough. Like, sorry, no. And on the flip side, I've had editors who just completely rewrite me, and I'm like, that's changing my voice, my intentions for the story. That's not what I was trying to say at all. That bothers me as well. So the kind of just right balance for me is I like to see them putting a lot of thought and effort into it, because I know that that means they really care about my story and want to help me. But when they do things that are on the more subjective side, they don't just do it. They actually suggest it in a comment. And maybe most important of all, whenever they're making these changes, they explain why they made the change. The reason this is the most important thing to me personally is because that's how I can learn and apply what I've learned to future books. And it makes the cost of the edit so much more worth it if I understand more about how to write a quality book down the road. One other thing you could do that I've never done myself, but I find it hilarious, is to intentionally add errors to whatever sample that you're sending them to see if they catch them. I've never done this, but I always wanted to. Okay, so you've done your research, you've found an editor you like that fits your timeline, your price range, your editing needs. Now what do you do? Actually hiring and working with your editor is pretty straightforward, but there are two really big pieces of advice I want to share that I had to learn the hard way. The first is to get a contract in place. It doesn't have to be anything special. It could literally just be like something you kind of like Googled how to do a contract and wrote up something very basic that you both sign and date. But this could save you so much headaches, depending on the person, of course. Some editors are amazing and you would never need this, but others will surprise you. And it's better to just have a contract in place so that you both have something to refer back to if expectations are not being met. Obviously includes your names, but the other things that I would include would be like your expected timeline. What is the specific start date and specific end date that you both agreed to? Get that in writing. What is the exact price you both agreed to? Also get that in writing so that nobody is, adding on unexpected fees or something like that. Include the type of edits that they plan to complete, so developmental, copy edits, line edits, whatever the case may be. And a lot of good quality editors have begun to use contracts in the last few years in my experience, so you might find that they already have one, they send it over to you. That is an awesome sign of a good editor. Make sure you read through it very carefully before you sign it, but I think that's a really good sign typically. Oh, and my second piece of advice before we move on is I would recommend not paying in full upfront. Like usually editors will have like a payment plan, maybe it's 2 or 3 or 4 throughout the process. Like usually there's a down payment to hold your spot and then there's a few more along the way. That's better than paying everything up front and getting ghosted. I've never had that happen to me, thank goodness, but I know 1 or 2 people who have experienced that. And I've also just had a bad experience where I ended the relationship before I finished my payments and I said, this is not working. Like the edits are making the book worse, honestly, so let's just part ways. And that was really hard for me to do. That's not something I'd ever want to do if I could help it. And if you find 1 or 2 errors, that's normal. Editors are just human, just like us. Like they're going to miss a couple things, which is why it's good to have multiple rounds of edits, multiple sets of eyes on your story besides your own. But if there are like hundreds of edits, or in my case, one time the person was actually adding errors to the book, then that is an okay time to stand up for yourself because you should get what you're paying for. Last but not least, we need to talk about when do you hire an editor, because if they are a really good quality editor, they're going to be booked months in advance. I actually have a favorite editor who is booked over a year out very frequently. And so that's a good sign. That means they're really great at what they do. But it also means that if you want to get your book out on a certain timeline, you need to book them and probably put in a down payment way in advance. You might even hire them when you're still in the first draft, or maybe more likely in the second or third draft, for months and months down the road. But how do you figure out when your book's going to be ready to send to them? How do you know what date to ask them for? That can be really tricky if you've never done this process before. The good news is, if you've watched this entire video, you already know that we have a section at the beginning all about how I create a book release timeline for my books that actually will help me know when to get an editor and find and hire them, as well as when I will need to send them my book. So if you missed that section, I will put the timestamp right here and you can jump back to that and watch that part again. That was a really big picture look at editors. I hope it was super helpful for you. Now let's take a look at cover design.
I'm super excited to do a video today with Mandy Lynn. We're going to talk about why covers are so important. And I have to say really quick, you guys, in case I haven't said this before, Mandy designed the cover that we're going to reveal today. Yeah. So I'm super excited. And if you want to share a little bit about yourself quick.
I'm an author, a fellow Authortuber, book cover designer, and the creator of the book launch planner. But today we're talking all about cover design. So yeah.
We're going to talk about all the questions that you guys sent in from over on Instagram when I asked, like, what do you want to know about cover design, why they're important? And we just want to really dive deep into helping you understand how much your cover affects your sales and therefore your success as an author. People do judge books by their covers, unfortunately. And so because of that, your cover is going to directly affect your author income. And so we really want to talk about what goes into making a cover Awesome. The first way that we judge books is based on the genre / the other books that we read. If you look at your bookshelf, you're going to buy books that are very similar to the books on your shelf.
Absolutely. Because if you're into, say, dystopian, you kind of know what book covers are associated with dystopian books.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I have the perfect example for this. There is this story about an erotica novel that I heard once where the cover was a sword and there weren't any people on it. And so it kind of looked a lot like the Graceland cover. I'll flash that on the screen. And a lot of people who like fantasy picked this book up and were unpleasantly surprised because expecting erotica. And so that's just an example of how important it is to match your genre and what readers expect, because they did not get what they expected.
Yes, there's a reason erotica has half naked people on the covers.
Yes. And then the second way we judge covers is based on their quality and their professionalism. And so what we mean by this is if they look like they're thrown together on some website, or if you had a professional cover designer like Mandy design them for you and you can tell the difference.
There's a lot of different things that go into design in general, but for cover design, one of the biggest things that when I first started that I kind of noticed set the bar between kind of an okay cover and an amazing cover is the fact that there's some sort of extra element to the text, whether that be it has a texture to it, it has fancy squirrels as an extension onto the text, or it's beveled. There's something going on with the text that makes the text stand out and makes the cover stand out.
And it's something that you can't like do as a non-designer without Photoshop. Like it's like I've seen so many self-published covers where the text looks like Times New Roman and it's like clearly it's like a very recognizable font, or they go too far the other way and they pick this totally unreadable font that's like swirls everywhere. The font really, really clarifies if it's done professionally or not. And so does how cluttered the cover is, which leads to the third judgment. If it's too cluttered, that screams non-professional.
Yeah, some people like to add little Easter eggs into their cover, and while that's nice to do, there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. If you want to add in little Easter eggs that your readers can catch after they have read your book and they're like, oh my God, that's from this scene, you want to do it in a very clean and professional way. Otherwise, you just end up with a cover that's too messy. A lot of the times, if someone's new to designing, they try a little bit too hard and they add in extra stuff that's not needed, when really the magic of designing comes to simplicity sometimes.
Absolutely agree. And the reason that authors like to add in so many elements is usually based on accuracy. And readers do judge a book based on its accuracy after reading a little bit, but usually not as much as you think. Like in my dystopian novels, I have them, the silhouettes are clearly wearing like jeans. And anyway, it's not always as important as you think.
Well, even I can give the same example for my own book, I Am Mercy, that takes place during 14th century France. So the clothing during that time would be very different. But on the cover, the girl or woman is wearing a dress that would definitely not be for that time, but it fits the book so well and it fits the mood of the book so well. That's not something that a reader is going to be like, that's not accurate.
Exactly. It comes down to like what's going to make the cover sell is far more important than having every detail of the story and every single chapter displayed on the cover. Those are some of the don'ts, like things to watch out for. But then we wanted to talk about some do's. So number one, we kind of hit on this, is readable font. And one of the reasons is because of the thumbnail size, which we should hit on really quick. It's when you shrink a book down to the tiniest, and it's like a thumbnail on Amazon, for example. And the book has to be catching their attention in that tiny, tiny size, because if it's not, they might never click on it to see more.
Right. So basically what you want to do is you want to choose a font that's easily readable, and you also don't want to add in so many effects to the font that it becomes lost in the effects or it blends in too much with the background. You want to make sure that even in that small thumbnail size, they can more or less read it. You're not always going to be able to read every single piece of text on the cover, but you want the title of the book to be readable.
Exactly. The title is also a marketing tool. So if it's readable, that's huge.
You have a good book cover, it'll sell itself.
Exactly. And then we put this as a maybe do. We were talking about how the human element, it does depend on the genre, but certain genres, it can be extremely helpful to have any human element, whether it's the full character or like a foot or a crown.
But one of the things I mentioned is oftentimes in thriller novels, especially, they tend to do more objects rather than people, because just thriller novels, it's usually the lack of a person adds into that suspense.
Intrigue.
Yeah, exactly. But for more young adult novels, you'll see more people on the covers because you want to make it relatable and more human.
Which leads to our third do. Honestly, it all comes down to matching the genre. There's like nothing more important than this. So we're going to go to Instagram and my poll that I ran where I asked you guys to ask questions about cover design, because I want to pull from, let me point the right way, pull from Mandy here as a cover designer. This is the perfect time to really hit home what's important about cover design. Julia Goodwin Writer says, at what stage do you look for a cover designer?
It really depends on how far out your cover designer is booked. If you have a cover designer that's like in high demand and they book out fast, you're going to want to book them sooner. But usually don't do it until you're actually starting the publishing process. So once you kind of have an idea of when you want your book to publish, then kind of work backwards to see when you need your cover ready by, and then see how much time your cover designer needs to actually design that cover. For me, it can take anywhere from 1 month to 3 months, depending on how many revisions are needed.
And I would also say I've had people on the other end, like, so Mandy's saying, like, don't wait till too late because you might have to push out your release. But then on the flip side, don't do it too early. I know somebody who got their cover before they'd even written the book, like no first draft, nothing. And your book could change. It could change genres, which again, if you're making a cover to match your genre, that's going to be a big deal.
Some people like to have a cover design because they think that's going to like help them become inspired to write this story. Yeah. But you could find out you don't even want to finish this manuscript and now you bought this cover that you can't even use.
Yes. Don't waste your money. Like, make sure you're actually ready to buy it before you buy it. Agreed. Quirky Work says the importance of font, which we really did hit on well, but I love that she's bringing it up. It's legibility, genre standard. We didn't really talk about that. So many bad fonts ruining covers. There are genre standards, aren't there, for fonts?
Yes. So like the first one that comes to mind would be like your classic romance. They tend to have very swirly fonts, and then you have like a classic beach read, which is very like standard, almost Times New Roman fonts. It's kind of boring, but it's also the genre. And then you have stuff like fantasy, again with the swirls. Sci-fi and thrillers tend to have the more modern fonts, but you kind of just want to look at what other covers of your genre are doing.
Absolutely. And I love this. This was a big question because Timmy asked it too, what fonts are best for different genres. So definitely do your Amazon research, or even better, hire a cover designer who already knows. I keep pointing the wrong way, like Mandy. Janine asks a question. What if you can't find a model that looks like your character? If you can't find a model that looks like your character, your cover designer probably can make it work.
It's called Photoshop.
Yes. And so watch our video tomorrow if you want to see how Mandy did that, because we definitely didn't have a model that naturally was right.
There was a lot of Photoshop involved, and once you guys watch the video, you'll understand just how much.
Wasn't it 116 layers?
Yes. Yeah. That's a lot of manipulation. That's actually not even counting the photoshopping that was done for the individual girl and the individual dress, because I did that in 2 different files because it was getting too much for my computer.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy. And you guys, it's really fun to watch. I just have to say that. It was really fun. This is from you. Where did you find your amazing cover designer? Let's see. Oh, here's a good one that I think is really good to address. If our cover does not match the genre that well, like I found out with mine, should we still use it? I have thoughts, but I'll let you start.
I mean, that's tough because especially if you're in the situation with Bethany where you paid a lot for your first round of covers and now you have to pay a lot for your second round, then it's also going to be like, is it going to be worth it? Hopefully you realize that the cover doesn't match before you pay for the entire series to be designed. Like someone else I know. But, it's just a matter of how much does it not match?
Yeah.
Is it looking like an entirely different genre? And do you think it'll be worth the investment?
That's such a good way to put it because, okay, so it's like a two-parter for me. Number one is like sometimes you just run into things. Like I finally revealed this in my live stream recently, but 8 Little Pages went out of business. They're bankrupt. So that was actually the instigator to my decision. And so that's like a negative, but the positive is it led me to realize that my book wasn't quite on genre, so to speak. And I don't think I would have realized that if I hadn't been paying really close attention. And so if you realize it, you can ask yourself, like Mandy said, how much is it off genre? I could have stuck with what I had, and I think it would have been okay. But ultimately, like we said at the beginning, covers lead to sales. So if you're like watching your sales, that's your biggest indicator. Should I switch? Is your cover making money? Maybe you're okay for a while. Maybe you can rebrand in a year because covers change anyway, right?
Yeah. We were talking about the Lunar Chronicles changed their covers, and how long have those books been out? Sometimes you do it just to give the book a fresh breath. I did that with my books.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Mercy, and she or Essence, and she's not here. The old covers seeing less sales. Let's give them a fresh breath.
Yes. Or like I did that with Evelyn's Number, where if you were like putting out a new book and it's been a while, you might be like, I want these to be more connected and I don't have the old designer to work with. I need the new designer to make them connected. Okay, here's a good one to ask Mandy. What is a good price to pay for a cover designer?
So before I started designing covers, I had paid someone $600 or $700 for my covers.
Yeah.
And that unfortunately is like a price that you can pay sometimes. I don't think I'd call that an outrageous price, but I think, as an indie author, that's really expensive. But you also have to keep in mind, like, you get what you pay for. So if you're paying like someone to design a cover for $100, they probably aren't as experienced. So the way a graphic designer tends to price themselves is they price themselves depending on how in demand they are. So if a cover designer gets more experience, they're going to slowly start raising their prices because they're more experienced. They have more to show, and they're also more in demand. So the clients they want are the clients that are more willing to pay extra. So I personally I price keeping in mind that I want to be budget friendly, but I also know my own worth. So you kind of just have to look at how much you're paying and also seeing what their portfolio is like, what experience they other clients had, because someone may have a gorgeous portfolio but be a terrible communicator, and that's like a huge thing. So you really just got to do your research before you book someone.
Yes, absolutely. Ask around even. Like I wish I had asked, well, things can change, but I feel like if you ask how somebody else's experience was, that can give you a really good clue. If you look at how their cover turned out and if it's really on point, that can let you know this cover designer's talented. They know what they're doing. Usually cover designers have portfolios, right? Like you said.
Yeah.
I feel like we nailed that one. That one's good. Bonnie's Journey says, for beginners or new authors, the most economical way to make a cover, would it be Canva?
So you can, there is that option. They have a template in there, but Canva does not do nearly as much as what Photoshop can do. And even if you have Photoshop and you have the subscription to Adobe, there's I don't even know the full extent of Photoshop. It's such an advanced program that I could use it every day for the rest of my life and probably never learn everything that's in there. So if you're a beginner, just find maybe either a beginner designer who's more within your budget, or maybe try learning it yourself. But just know, like, using programs like Canva, there's so much you can't do in Canva I barely use Canva. I use it as a shortcut tool, but I can't stand it because I know what Photoshop is like.
And I do use Canva a lot, and I have made like really, really basic placeholder covers. Like if I needed to, I don't know, put something on Amazon before I was ready for the real cover reveal, for example, or maybe to order like a proof for myself before I'd ever hired a cover designer, but it's never the same quality. And you can tell, and I feel like we've hit home enough in this video already, that your cover is what sells your book. So you do not want readers to see a crappy cover, and you really do need professional covers. I really just want to say, like, if you're not selling it and you're doing it for yourself, Canva can work, but otherwise, don't do that.
Even if like you're someone on Wattpad, people on Wattpad design their own covers all the time. I also see people on Wattpad hire people to design their covers, but whatever floats your boat.
You're not making money there, so I wouldn't.
Some people, I've seen people get picked up off of Wattpad to be published, like many authors. So I guess so.
Why not? Do different POD companies require different formats of the cover? KDP versus Ingram Spark, for example?
Yes, and I hate it. So KDP is pretty standard in what they require, and then Ingram Spark is very different because they print it in a more professional way. Not to say that KDP isn't, but as a graphic designer and as someone who's worked full-time as a graphic designer, the way you prepare files for print is very different than the way you prepare files for print for KDP. Like, if you looked at the ready-to-print file, Ingram Spark has a ton of white space with like a barcode and all that. Also, depending on your printing company, the thickness of the pages will vary. So the thickness of your spine will vary even if you have the same exact page count for each edition.
Timmy asks, are there any genre-based colors that suit them best, or color tones maybe?
The only one that I can think of is like thrillers tend to be more darker, whereas like fantasies will be a little bit brighter unless it's like a dark fantasy. That's really the only pattern would be whether it would be light or dark, because otherwise you can kind of use whatever color. Like you'll probably very rarely see pink on like a dark fiction,
right? Yeah,
accent, very like bright but small accent. But otherwise, you can kind of play around with colors. It's more just how light or dark the colors are going to be that you need to keep in mind.
That makes so much sense. Like your colors will almost match the mood. So that's all we have for today. Thank you, Mandy, for joining me. Thank you guys for watching, and have a great day. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
If you're feeling overwhelmed right now, just know, first of all, that's totally normal. Self-publishing is so complicated. But also I want you to know that you can come back to this video at any time. I'm going to include chapters so you can kind of skip to the sections that you want a refresher on if you ever need one. But there is a good chance that you still have a lot of questions, because honestly, despite how many hours and hours and hours of time and effort I've put into this video series, there's still so much more to know about self-publishing. So if you want to dive deeper into these topics and a lot of other topics related to self-publishing and get some free downloadables and templates and a workbook and all that goodness, then yes, I do have a self-publishing course. It's on Udemy. I will link it below if you want to check it out, where I go way more in depth on all of these topics and so many more. I'll put the link to that in the description and in the comment box below. And just FYI, it very frequently goes on sale for just $10 or $15, depending on Udemy and whatever little elves they have working behind the scenes. I don't know. But even if you're just curious, definitely go check out to see what was not covered here, to read the awesome testimonials, and just see if it's a good fit for you. Whew. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this free masterclass, over 6 hours of helpful content. I hope it was super valuable to you. And if you want to give back in a free way to help me out, just give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment. Those are really, really helpful. YouTube loves to see that. And subscribe if you're interested in more videos like this in the future. Oh, and definitely share with your author friends, because that also really, really helps me out. Thank you so much. I hope you have an amazing time self-publishing. You've got this.